Welcome everyone to our panel, RealFi from Cardano, opening up opportunities for everyone. I am Joanna Ossinger, the Asia Crypto Czar at Bloomberg News, and I am pleased to be speaking with Charles Hoskinson, who basically needs no introduction, and Romain Pellerin, the Chief Technology Officer, and Dinal Patel, Chief Product Officer. So let's get started. Charles, if you can talk a little bit about what is RealFi? Does the concept replace DeFi? Is it an evolution of it? Or is it something that can coexist? How do they align?
Well, first off, thank you so much for joining us, John. It's an honor to have you here. And, let's talk about the industry and DeFi and RealFi. How do all these pieces come together? So decentralized finance is a kind of a term that's a bit nebulous right now. And it kind of stands for things like oracles and dexes and stable coins and all these other things that we've seen crop up on Ethereum and other platforms. And usually there's some idea that these platforms are somehow decentralized. So they're different from traditional legacy providers like Bloomberg and Thomson Reuters and banks and exchanges like Coinbase. And of course, there's a varying degree of opinion on what does decentralization mean there. We decided that it made sense to kind of create a superset of DeFi, and we're calling that RealFi, and it's really a combination of a collection of things. And so first, we've noticed that a lot of DeFi applications tend not to have a notion of identity for their participants and users. And that can be identity in an abstract sense, not just people, but also devices, things, other smart contracts. And that's kind of a core building block if you're going to talk about the large scale movement of information and value. Second, there's kind of the twin of identity, which is metadata. This is the who, what, where, when, how of transactions. And it's exceedingly important, especially in financial transactions, that there be rich metadata in them. And a lot of DeFi has inconsistent standards about how that's going to be applied. Third, you tend to need some notion of governance for these types of platforms. So how do they grow? How do they evolve? How do they change? Normally under centralized finance, that's very clear. Coinbase gets to decide how the Coinbase trading platform is going to stay competitive, grow, and evolve and change. But unfortunately, when you go to the decentralized world, that becomes a much more difficult situation because a lot of the participants and users of these platforms don't have the domain expertise necessary to understand what to do with them and how to evolve them. They just want to be consumers. Yet if not them having a say, then who does have to say in how these things evolve and change? Then you have the issue of standards and certification. We've seen tons of hacks, some in the tens, some in the hundreds of millions of dollars in the DeFi space, and those hacks are having a profound effect on consumer confidence, consumer protections, and overall the viability and growth of this ecosystem. So how do you ensure that they're secure and they follow standards and they're interoperable with each other? You can ensure them, you can regulate them. Speaking of regulation, how do you automate regulation so that regulation can work in a way where it's built right into the transaction itself? And then finally, there's a product market fit where a lot of these applications tend to be consumed by affluent kids in New Jersey or other places. But then, the reality is, if you're talking about peer-to-peer lending, peer-to-peer insurance, a replacement of the legacy financial infrastructure, that's really a conversation for people who are underserved or unserved in those domains. So, for example, if you're a farmer in Kenya or a business owner in San Salvador, in El Salvador, a lot of these people pay 6% a month or more for lending rates. Which is just absolutely predatory and usurious, but they do that because they don't have access to any other system. The point of RealFi is to say, let's put a combination of these things together to be able to serve these right markets, real people, real finance, and thus be able to actually innovate and do interesting things. Now, it's important caveat here. We're not saying these things are compulsory. They're optional. The point of great systems and great platforms is that they give the people who build on top of them a toolbox, and then they decide how to use that toolbox for their customers. And that's another point of saying that RealFi is a superset of DeFi because you can re-implement the existing DeFi experiences that you want just the way they are today or you can continue to add to them. And when we look at the regulatory environment, we look at where things are going, it's very clear that there's a demand for standards. It's very clear that regulation is coming for DeFi. For example, Uniswap looks like it just got some attention from the Securities Exchange Commission. There was a Wells notice from Coinbase, and these types of things. And as a consequence, over the next 12, 24 months, it's our belief that the majority of DeFi providers will be systematically upgrading to RealFi, to actually encumber identity and metadata, to create proper standards and make sure that they're secure and functional, and to also make sure that they resolve the issues of regulation and governance, and also they're in the market for new customers. Cardano has always been about entering the developing world. We really want to focus on the 3 billion who don't have reliable access to financial services. And if you look at a lot of the markets that we play in, we're super excited about bringing those markets in through identity and through wallets to the cryptocurrency space, and then giving them access to RealFi. So for the first time ever, they can actually participate in a global market fairly.
Okay, thank you. So identity is something that can easily be taken for granted. So what are some of the situations or examples of people who are living without identity, and what does it restrict them from accessing? Danal, can you take that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I think, first of all, it's important to recognize really the scale of the problem. Over a billion people have no identity, and many of those include subsistence farmers and refugees. And the primary roadblocks that keep these billion people locked out of traditional identification systems include things like lack of access. They're not even able to get to an office where you can get an ID, costs associated with getting those ID, cumbersome paperwork processes, and also the lack of knowledge about how to get an ID. And conversely, with all of that, over these billion people actually have mobile phones. And what this does, it paves the way for blockchain-based mobile identity systems like we're building with Atala Prism.
Okay, interesting. So what are some of the current barriers to DeFi adoption, and how do you see Cardano solving them?
Well, some of the ones I see, clearly over-collateralization is a problem where, people have to put up 200 or 300% collateral before they can take out a loan. And, we're looking to solve that with Cardano by introducing novel mechanisms for credit rating or credit scoring. We've got concepts around leveraging Atala Prism, for example, to build a credit bureau, or even working together with telecom partners for AI-based credit scoring. Another big issue is around user experience. Many of our competitors in the DeFi space, you've got many projects with many different tokens. And one of the things that we're looking to do really is to enable this more frictionless DeFi experience with concepts like native stablecoins and oracles. Another big one is security. Every other day you're hearing about, a major hack. In Cardano, some of the things we're looking to introduce is a really robust certification framework that really extends the secure platform that we've built, and being able to carry this right through to the dApps that are built on top of Cardano. The other thing I would say is really broad-based adoption. DeFi is quite niche, mostly focused on the core crypto industry, whereas we're really looking to open this up, enabling really financial opportunities for everyone. Another key thing is really volatile fees. So people that are looking to build a business, this is something that they have to deal with, especially when prices of assets really spike. On Cardano, we're looking to, we've actually introduced some papers which talk about, some of our ideas around building stable fees on the protocol.
Okay, and Charles, did you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, in general, it's a game of iteration. So the key behind a successful DeFi strategy, I think, is built in 3 different layers. So your first layer is saying, okay, how do the underlying protocols evolve, and how do we learn from each other, and how do we make sure they actually do what's on the label? So if you're saying an oracle, you have to be pretty good at injecting information into the system, and that information has to be accurate. And you have to be, as a consumer of the information, able to assess the level of veracity, the truthiness of such things. If you're talking about a DEX, you have to at least be somewhat comparable in terms of user experience and use cost to legacy systems, or otherwise, why are you doing it? If you're talking about a stable coin, you have to be at least as stable as the US dollar or some medium that we tend to use, or else how can you convince somebody who's holding cash, go take this thing that is less stable than the thing that you're already used to having? So there's a comparability there in terms of user experience and ease of use that has to be resolved, and that has to be standardized across the entire industry for liquidity purposes. Second, you have to have the right collaborative model for getting these protocols into the hands of people who are in the jurisdictions that need them the most. So not everybody has connectivity, for example. And this is why we got partners like World Mobile. This is why we think a lot about a hub and spoke model, where you have maybe someone in town who has an internet connection, and that person can serve an entire community, and it doesn't then require everybody in the community to have a cell phone or have internet connectivity and so forth. And that person effectively becomes a small business model for like a last mile issue. And then third, you have to have the right funding in this to ensure that these solutions can grow and evolve. And what makes Cardano very unique is that we have Catalyst. So there's almost $1 billion of ADA sitting there ready to be deployed for the community, that every like a heartbeat, 6 to 8 weeks, a new funding round begins. And those funding rounds basically allow the community from all around the world, they don't have to be from Silicon Valley or New York or Singapore or London, they can be in Kampala, they can be in Lagos, they can be in, Batumi. It doesn't really matter where they're at. They can say, hey, I have this great idea, big or small, and let's go ahead and decentralize the access to capital. So if you have those three components of the right standards and the equivalent user experience to the legacy system and the cost level to the legacy system, you have the right business models in terms of the right participants like merchants and other things, and you address connectivity issues and so forth, and you combine that with funding, I think that's really the secret sauce and why we have yet to see significant adoption of DeFi in places like El Salvador, in places like Argentina, in places like Congo or South Africa, the places that frankly need them the most. We're just not quite there. And then finally, you need to have a good story about how will regulation be addressed in the future for all of these things. And what makes this such a complicated discussion is that you're dealing with a transnational regulatory problem. So everybody tends to think, well, what does the U.S. Treasury Department care about? Well, in some cases, that doesn't matter at all. The regulations that may be relevant could be 12 other countries that have nothing to do with the U.S. Treasury Department. So the question is, how do you, in an environment where you could build an application where literally you could have users from 150 countries concurrently who are small value, and there's no central reporting entity, how do you ensure that those 150 different countries are happy? And if they're not, well, how does that get sorted out? This is the great challenge of the adoption of DeFi and RealFi. Traditionally, there was a gatekeeper model. You would go and create an account, and the person you're creating the account with would be held liable if there was a problem to that. And they would make decisions of whether they wanted you as a customer or not. For example, many people in the United States who try to get bank accounts abroad, because the cost of regulation is so onerous, they actually get denied accounts. It was very difficult for me as a U.S. citizen to get a bank account in Switzerland. And it was very difficult for our company to get a bank account in Hong Kong when we were there with HSBC, not because of local regulation, but because of compliance with the U.S. regulator. Well, you can do that as a centralized business. You can't do that as an open access protocol that welcomes everybody and serves everybody. So the big meta challenge, in addition to those three sub-challenges for growth and adoption, is how do you actually create a system where people can have their cake and eat it too. And basically the system self-regulates and it self-maintains, and it has things like consumer protection. It has things like transparency of flow of funds and these things, so that there's not money laundering or terrorist financing or these types of problems. And that's the great balancing act. What's really cool, though, is that we see a lot of proactive regulatory innovation happening in the developing world, where these countries are actually encoding in their laws standards, even inside the United States, like, for example, Wyoming with the Dow law, or other things we've seen where they've said, hey, Bitcoin is now legal tender. It's pretty cool to see that. And that bodes very well for functional automated regulation to actually be baked inside of the protocol. And I think those factors together are the glue that's going to bind a migration of people from the legacy system to the new system. If anything, just because of the lower transaction fees, the lower operating costs, in some cases orders of magnitude, and also the ability to access emerging markets, which collectively are worth trillions of dollars, but are currently inaccessible. Roman, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, two things. One is interoperability is needed between systems. So like you said, we need standards to be defined. So people who are in different countries can actually interact and through a smart contract. Because if you can't connect your system or define your system through the smart contract, you can't interact, basically. So enforcing interoperability, standard, certifying that an application is actually compatible with a standard, being sure that the model that you handle, the data that you share can be consumed elsewhere. For example, when I moved to the US, I actually lost my banking history and my health record, right? I was a newborn here in the US. That's an example of disconnected systems. So interoperability is required, but you also need security. And the security is absolutely essential for RealFi. Those systems, Cardano and other blockchain, will actually run the financial operating system of tomorrow. And in order to take this responsibility, you need to provide the security associated to the users and also to the developers of the smart contracts that are going to encode processes in the blockchain and describe and define services. So we have things in the pipe for this, with certification, verification of smart contracts.
Okay, great. And so now let's talk a little bit more about some of what this means for users in kind of the wider ecosystem in the world. So, if you can maybe just elaborate on some of the things we've discussed. For instance, safety. So how does IOG's research-led approach to Cardano make it a safer solution for DeFi? Charles, can you take that one?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny thing where you have these systems that are valued now equivalent to what you would expect from a Fortune 500 company that has decades of legacy, armies of scientists, armies of engineers. And then you have all these kids running it, and when something breaks, they say, oh, well, it is what it is, open source project, buyer beware. I think the industry has to have higher standards about quality and about safety, and also about assurance that the things we're claiming are true. When you talk about the world of protocols, the assurance is from science. So when I say something is provably secure, when I say something works, when I say something can defend against an adversary, we have a standard that we've been following for over 40 years in the academic world. It's the peer review process. And we do this for cryptography. And it works so well that the military trusts it for secure communications, the intelligence agencies trust it for classified information. So we think we should use those same processes and standards about getting to truth, about resilience against adversaries, and engage the same institutions. So, for example, universities, academics, professors, graduate students, postdocs, and go through the same burdens that they have to go to get tenure, i.e. publish, write papers, have those papers go through peer review. If anything, because then objective third party, neutral third parties can come in and say what is true, what's not true. When you ask anybody, is your product great? Is your product safe? Is your product, oh, of course it's great and it's safe and it's secure. It's just like going to a drug company. Is your product safe? If I take it, will it give me the things that you want? Well, before the FDA existed, We had people going around mixing mercury and cocaine together and putting a little bit of radium on top and saying, this will cure all that ails you. And they said, yeah, okay, maybe we should change that system a little bit. They said, perhaps you have to provide evidence of the claims that you make, that these things do what you claim they do. And that's basically all we ask. And that evidence is the standards and burdens that the academic community uses. Now, on the software side, you also can do evidence. And this is used all the time in the aerospace industry. This is done all the time in building trains or other things where you have systems where the failure of that system results in the loss of billions of dollars or life or both. So every single time you get on an airplane, every single time an astronaut gets into a rocket or a space shuttle, every single time you write medical software where the pacemaker has to work, all of those things, if that fails, you're dead. And so you have to use different standards for how you write that software and a chain of evidence that the software was written correctly. And we have so many examples where every now and then we kind of didn't measure up, like the Boeing 737 MAX that crashed in Ethiopia. And it turned out that there were some very significant and severe software issues there alongside design failures in that system, which would have been resolved with the use of formal methods. So what we do is we take formal methods engineering, which is a subdomain within computer science, and we apply those techniques and tools to translate the science that we write into code. Now, why is this not done in Silicon Valley or in industry? Well, because it's very, very methodical, expensive, and perceived to be quite slow. So the real innovation that input-output figured out was, how do we over time build processes and systems where we can apply these two things, the peer review process and the formal methods process, with not necessarily a heavy touch and not necessarily a light touch, but just right, that Goldilocks zone for the class of protocols that we have, so we don't have to wait 10 years for something to get done. You can get things done in months to years that normally would take decades under the old model. And the advantage of that is we catch a huge amount of bugs, design flaws, or semantical issues up front before that software is deployed to the customer. Second, by doing that, you eventually can upgrade those tools to a point where those tools become accessible for small to medium-sized businesses, entrepreneurs who want to apply a light touch to ensure that their dApps and their applications are actually successful. So one of the beautiful things that's an output of what we've developed is that we actually have multiple certification partners that are presenting here at the conference, from QVIC to Runtime Verification and Twig and others, who actually have tools and techniques that a dApp developer can utilize. Some are automated, some are manual, and they can be utilized in the weeks to months to get a high level of assurance that the application was designed correctly. And ultimately, what does that mean? Less DAO hacks, less Thor chains, lots of all of these types of things that we've seen in the industry, so that there's a higher degree of certainty that these things are built correctly. So it was very expensive to get here. We as a company, I think, probably have spent well more than $50 million getting those processes right over the last 6 years. And we've had to work with many different people in industry, like we're founding members of the Haskell Foundation. We've invested a lot of money in formal methods tools. We've become core developers of the classical Haskell compiler. We have a lot of experts in formal methods in our company, and we regularly contribute to those. And we've even had to build bespoke tools for Plutus and for Cardano smart contracts in general, specifically to assist that. But that all of that infrastructure was built to be a toolbox for the application builder in their decision about what is the Goldilocks zone of quality and assurance for their application. Furthermore, the academic process that we followed has inspired dozens, if not hundreds, of scientists that we've never met, we don't pay, to come into our industry and start writing papers in our industry. And what that means is you have a culturally neutral, linguistically neutral, gender neutral viewpoint of these things, where suddenly there's no founder. There's now a decentralized brain that encompasses the academy, and they know that by publishing papers and doing research in our industry that they can actually get tenure. There's been over 111 papers we've written as a company. And there's a lot of derivative work of those papers, like Nakamoto proof of stake, for example, that came from scientists that we didn't have a relationship with. They just saw the work that we had done and they realized there was merit there and decided to do a follow-up work from it. So that ensures the long-term viability and the vibrance of protocol innovation. because you don't need a central entity. You have a web of universities that are always refreshing and renewing. Every year there's always new graduate students coming in. Every year there's new people starting new things. And there's many governments and other entities, student tuition, that fund that innovation. So there's a diverse set of funding as well for constant protocol innovation. So it's a beautiful ecosystem in that respect, and it's really come together, but it was tough to get it to that point. It took years and well more than $50 million. So I wouldn't want to go through all of it again, but I'm glad that we're on the other side.
Oh, we're interesting. Okay, thank you. So how will this work in, say, low infrastructure regions where internet access isn't guaranteed? Dinal, can you address that?
Well, specifically to different wallet solutions, we're building a range of different wallet solutions for different stakeholders. So we recognize the fact that these stakeholders might have different devices, from feature phone, smartphone, a laptop. And one of the things that we're doing specifically for the unbanked segment, who we know might not have connectivity, is we're partnering together with a number of providers who have low-cost hardware wallets, which are capable of holding their value and also their identity. And all these users need to do really is just to present this card at a point of interaction and authenticate themselves, and then they're able to benefit from a lot of the capabilities that we're enabling through the Cardano platform.
Okay, and Romain, maybe you can talk about what are the benefits of developing this in an open source way.
So blockchains are decentralized networks, and so open source is mandatory to run an operating system and develop an operating system at a large scale globally. So open source facilitates collaboration. You can look at the code, you can bring the new features that you want to see in the system. You can review features and prioritize features. So there's a strong need or benefit for coordinating development in a large scale community with contributors from everywhere in the world. It's also important for that no one owns the protocols, right? So it's in open source. No one owns it. Everyone can contribute and bring a new feature. When you contribute, you can actually, since we have the same code base, you can look at who is contributing. So you can actually organize the development. You can retribute developers for their contributions, for example. So open source is absolutely mandatory for us if we want our protocols to become standard that everyone are relying on. The security, it brings security for the code base, because everyone looks at it. So the more eyes you have on a crypto primitive or on a networking protocol, the better quality you'll have at the end. Everyone can review and verify that everything works correctly. Even the users can, since smart contracts on chain are in clear, you have the code source of the application available to you, right? So you can verify on the fly that you are interacting with the right contract, and that code is the one that has been validated by the community. So openness, transparency, all of this is absolutely required if we want to become the standard for finance.
Okay, and Romain, can you talk a little bit also about volatility of fees, for instance, being a sticking point in adoption in the smart contract space? So how is IOG looking to change that?
So we have several ways of dealing with this. So the first one is actually reacting to the movement in prices of the base layer currency. So we have protocol parameters we can adjust to actually compensate this evolution of price. But we are working on stable fees. So using a stable coin to pay the fees of a contract. And what we also announced is the Babel fees, the fact that tokens can actually use their own token to define fees, and for the users to pay for a particular service relying on a particular token, this can be paid in a particular in the underlying token. So I'm sure Dinal and Charles have ideas on this.
Yeah, I mean, predictability of cost is an absolutely essential thing for infrastructure. Could you imagine building a business where they say, okay, well, the cost of electricity could be $10 today and tomorrow $1,000, and your margin's $500? You'd say, well, some days I'm making great money and other days I'm actually losing money. How do I know? And they say, well, you can't. And that's basically where we're at when we talk about computational infrastructure for smart contracts. There's a huge amount of volatility. And the other thing is that there's two competing demands that tug against each other that are irreconcilable in a certain respect. So one demand is this demand for Bitcoin-style economics, where you have a finite monetary policy, capped supply, and use and utility creates appreciation of the underlying asset. That's what we've seen with Bitcoin. But then for a computational fuel, what you care about is predictable cost. Okay, so you want that to be stable over a long horizon. You don't want it to do this or do that. You want it just to do that, because then I can make a decision. Does this make sense for my business model? And ideally, you'd like that cost to actually go down or stay constant with the set of users that you have. So what that means is that you need to have the accommodation of both these monetary policies in order for the system to be stable and sustainable. And that's one of the things that we've been looking very closely at. Can we construct fee models and structures where you can enjoy Bitcoin-style monetary policy, but at the same time, when you're talking about the consumption of computational fuel, that actually has some sort of price stability about it. And so we have some great papers and ideas. We published a blog post recently on Babel fees. We've been talking about stable fees for a while. And what's nice about the design of Cardano is that this can layer quite beautifully on the system that we have. And with community consent, the community can make some decisions of how close to the protocol do they want these things to be. They can run as layer 2, they can run as applications, or they can be built into the protocol itself. And, the people are in charge. They'll make ultimately the decisions of where they want to go and what they want to do. And we just kind of provide options. Now, one other point is that whenever you talk about complexity is usually in a diverse system handled by heterogeneity. So, for example, human beings were very complicated compared to single-cell organisms. Okay, so what do human beings require? We have eye cells and nerve cells and heart tissue and reproductive tissue and so forth. So we have different cells that are specialized for certain tasks, and they work together interdependently, and they create one organism that's then capable of dealing with a more complicated environment. Well, similarly, when you talk about the need for DeFi, suddenly you've gone well beyond a store of value and push transactions like where Bitcoin exists. Now you're talking about identity, and you're talking about metadata, and actually you're talking about specialization, where certain actors in the system form certain tasks and utility. So, for example, the existence of proof of stake admits the existence of a stake pool operator. That's a specialized piece of tissue in the system, and that allows then acceleration and unification of faster network broadcast and all kinds of things that allows a more complicated organism. Well, you can reuse that infrastructure for other tasks, especially for computation. And this is the power of things like Hydra and the power of things like sidechains. The existence of SPOs means they can maintain the consensus of not just one system, but many systems, and those other systems can have different computational assumptions. The main chain can be Plutus and the extended UTXO model, which the Ethereum people seem to love a lot today. Or you could have another chain, which is the EVM, or another chain, which is LLVM, that's Yella, and then suddenly you have legacy programming languages that you can bring in. All of those can live in one system, different competing computational models with different monetary policies, different computing fields. And then the operators themselves can actually be hubs for distributed computation. So that means the more stake pools that you have, the more parallelism you get in the processing of smart contracts. So overall, the more resources that are available. And this is what we mean by building a sustainable but scalable system. Those are those two hallmarks. And then in an interoperable system, that third hallmark of a third generation cryptocurrency, the ability to do many things that allow specialized tissue to form within inside the system. So it's a bear of a problem, and there's many moving pieces, and that's why being the CTO and the chief product officer of this organization, two of the hardest roles, because you kind of have to be both wide in your skill sets and deep at the same time in your skill sets. But we've managed to, I think with Cardano, get the right balance of things. And that wasn't for lack of trying. We spent about 6 years very clearly thinking about this model, and we have, I think, the right set of features and functionality that will enable this interoperable, scalable, yet sustainable system and achieve that dual monetary policy goal of a Bitcoin-style monetary policy that people have come to know and love in the industry, but then cost stability for those who are actually building businesses on these systems.
Okay, thanks, Charles. So actually, we just have a few minutes left. So maybe if you can kind of wrap up with how you build a solution that can serve the needs of everyone, say governments, enterprises, individuals. I think we have about 3 minutes left. So
well, why don't we talk about the Ministry of Education deal that we've been doing in Ethiopia? Donald, do you want to give a shot at that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe I'll start answering that from a different perspective as well. I mean, one of the things I've been doing in my team as well is reorganizing ourselves so that we obsess really about each of these stakeholders. So if you take Cardano as an example, we've got product managers that are obsessing about the stake pool experience. We've got product managers that are looking at the API layer and obsess about the exchange experience, how partners can integrate with Cardano. We've actually created a new role around smart contracts and developer experience as well, so that we provide basically the best tools to build on Cardano and really lower the barriers of entry as well. And we're investing heavily as well, actually, in more user-facing applications like our light wallets, and employing as well a lot of design thinking methodologies around that. And we spent quite a lot of resource in terms of user experience to make these as easy as possible. And we've spent a lot of time actually speaking to many stakeholders in the community that will use these wallets. And I think the more obsessed we are with our customers and users, and also acknowledging the fact that it's quite a diverse set of users, that's how we actually will craft a platform and an ecosystem that really works for everyone.
Okay, great. Okay, so now we have about 2 minutes. Charles, do you want to do wrap up?
Sure. What would you like to wrap up?
Well, just what are the benefits of this? How does it work for everyone? And kind of what's a takeaway that you want everyone to get?
Well, I think the final takeaway, at least for me, is that the building of Cardano has been like a spiral. And when that spiral is very tight, you can only do a small set of things. But then as the spiral grows, you get larger and larger, grander and grander, more and more people come in, more and more entities come in. And now we're in a position where there's more than a dozen development companies that just worry about the infrastructure of Cardano. And there's tens of thousands of people actively involved in the governance of Cardano. And there are thousands of stake pools involved in the maintenance of the ecosystem. And that's where we're at today here in 2021. And what's beautiful about this is baked into the DNA of the system is this idea of progressive decentralization and inclusiveness. We keep adding. So we keep gaining users, we keep gaining projects, we keep gaining capabilities. So that spiral continues to grow. And what's beautiful is that we're following first principles. So we're not beholden to the ideas of Bitcoin or Ethereum or the legacy financial system. We're really just starting from the perspective of, if you could reimagine how the world works, how would you do it differently? And what's so cool about it is we were kind of given that opportunity as a project. We were given a blank slate to go hire the scientists. We were given a blank slate to go do new engineering or write completely new code. And we've gotten to a point where so many people have come on board that the project is stable and it's going to be here forever. It's just a question now of what level of impact are we going to have, and ultimately what use and utility will this paradigm be most useful for. My belief is you could run a nation state on this type of infrastructure. Not today, but in 3 to 5 years, definitely possible. My belief is also that this is going to give us a lot of real-life data about how to do governments differently. A macro problem that you see in society as a whole is people are fundamentally unhappy with governance. That's why we have the protests. That's why we have so much lack of trust in institutions. That's why basic things like do vaccines work or not, there's so much skepticism of that. Under ordinary, normal circumstances, people would trust institutions. They'd say, oh, yeah, everything's fine. But now no one trusts anything. There's always a conspiracy theory somewhere lurking somewhere. And so that it tells you that there's an appetite for new systems, new ways of governance, new types of institutions. Instead of saying trust us, says can't lie. Instead of don't be evil, it says can't be evil. These types of things. And what Cardano's trying to do is position itself in the marketplace of ideas to be a legitimate option for at least some of these systems and some of these institutions. Now, I'm an ambitious guy. I'm kind of young. So I'd like all the institutions and all the systems. But, maybe we get just voting, or maybe we just get payments, or maybe we just get a better way of running the currencies of nation states that's a bit more fair and it can't be influenced or coerced by politicians. Who knows where that gets cut? But, of course, if we are lucky, my belief is that ultimately it's going to push us towards a much more fair and transparent, open and decentralized world with systems that aren't so volatile, where some days they work, some days they don't work, some day everything is great, and the next day it's 2008 and the whole market's collapsed. Some days you're happy with your voting system and then you're not happy the next day. I don't think any of us like living in those worlds filled with so much inconsistency, and it's about time we get back to stability and normality.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that, Romain, Dinal, Charles. Really appreciate you sharing your thoughts, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.